The year was 2247 when the first alien ship appeared in Earth's sky. The Valorian Collective had been watching humanity for decades, and they finally decided to make contact. They found a simple civilization that had just learned to travel between planets. Humans had small colonies on Mars and a few mining stations in the asteroid belt. Their ships were slow, and their weapons were weak. The Valorians looked at humanity and saw nothing to fear. Admiral Grace Palmer stood on the bridge of the ESV Wanderer and watched the alien vessel approach. She was 53 years old, with gray hair and tired eyes. She had served in the space fleet for 30 years, but her real job was something no alien would ever know about. She was the commander of a secret force that existed in the shadows. Lieutenant Kevin Brooks looked up from his console and said that the aliens wanted permission to dock. Grace told him to allow it and reminded him to remember his training. They were peaceful explorers and nothing more. Kevin nodded because he understood. Every human in the fleet knew the secret. They had been trained since childhood to play their role. The Valorians were tall and elegant with silver skin and large dark eyes. They walked through the Wanderer and examined everything with amusement. The human technology was primitive by their standards. The fusion reactors were outdated. The weapon systems were almost laughable. The Valorian ambassador told Grace that humanity had potential, but they were far behind the rest of the galaxy. Grace smiled politely and thanked them for their kind words. Inside, she was thinking about the ships hidden in dimensions that the Valorians could not even detect. She was thinking about weapons that could crack planets open like eggs. She was thinking about 300 years of preparation. The secret began in 2089, when a research team discovered something buried deep beneath the Antarctic ice. It was an alien vessel millions of years old. The technology inside was so advanced that it would have made humanity one of the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy overnight. But the leaders of Earth made a different choice. They gathered in secret and signed the Antarctic Accord. Every major nation agreed to hide what they had found. They would study the alien technology and build upon it, but they would never reveal it to anyone. Humanity would appear weak and harmless while they built their true strength in secret. General Marcus Young was the first commander of the Black Veil program. He wrote in his journal that they had seen how the galaxy treated the weak. They had also seen how the strong were feared and targeted. It was better to be underestimated than destroyed. They would smile and wave and pretend to struggle with basic technology while building weapons that would make gods tremble. 300 years passed and humanity spread across 47 colony worlds. To the rest of the galaxy, they were a minor civilization that could barely keep their ships running. They struggled with terraforming, and their military was almost non-existent. Other races looked at them with pity or amusement, but in dimensions that no other species had discovered, there were shipyards the size of moons. There were weapons platforms that could destroy entire fleets in seconds. There were 247,000 warships crewed by soldiers who had trained their entire lives for a war that might never come. Grace Palmer came from a family of secrets. Her grandmother had been one of the original scientists who studied the Antarctic vessel. Her mother had commanded the first true human warship that was hidden in a pocket dimension. Grace herself now commanded both the public fleet that everyone saw and the Obsidian Guard that no one knew about. She walked through the corridors of the Wanderer after the Valorians departed. The crew moved around her doing their jobs and playing their roles. A young ensign bumped into her and apologized nervously. Grace told her it was fine and kept walking. That ensign was also trained in weapon systems that could tear holes in reality itself. Every human learned the truth when they turned 18. It was the greatest secret in the history of their species. They learned about the Antarctic discovery and the 3 centuries of deception. They learned about the shadow fleets and the terrible weapons. and they learned their duty to keep pretending until the day humanity chose to reveal itself. Some found it difficult to play weak when they knew they were strong. Grace had struggled with it herself when she was young. She remembered wanting to show the arrogant Valorians what humans could really do. But her mother had taught her patience. The deception protected them. Every year they stayed hidden was another year to grow stronger. The galaxy was a dangerous place. Empires rose and fell. Species were conquered and enslaved. Entire worlds were destroyed in wars that lasted centuries. Humanity watched it all and learned. They studied the tactics of conquerors and the mistakes of the defeated. They improved their technology and expanded their hidden forces. Ambassador Daniel Harris was the public face of humanity in the galaxy. He attended meetings at the Galactic Assembly and negotiated trade deals that always seemed to favor the other side. He let alien diplomats talk down to him and accepted insults with a humble smile. But Daniel was also a member of the High Council that controlled the Obsidian Guard. He reported to Grace after every diplomatic mission. The Cathari Empire was expanding aggressively and had conquered 7 civilizations in the past 50 years. The Syndicate of Orion was watching human colonies with interest. The Pale Assembly had suggested that humanity might benefit from their protection in exchange for certain resources. Grace listened to all of it and filed the information away. The shadow fleets were ready. The weapons platforms were armed. 247,000 warships waited in dimensions that folded around normal space like a glove around a wand hand. She looked out at the stars from her quarters that night and thought about her grandmother. The old woman had died believing that humanity would have to fight for survival someday. She had dedicated her life to making sure they would win that fight. Grace wondered if that day would come soon. The Cathari were getting bolder. The other powers were getting greedier. Sooner or later someone would push humanity too far, and then the galaxy would learn what 300 years of preparation really meant. They would learn that the weak little humans with their primitive ships had been lying the entire time. They would learn about the shadow fleets and the planet crackers and the weapon that could kill stars. But not today. Today Grace would smile and pretend and wait. The secret had kept humanity safe for 3 centuries. It would keep them safe a little longer. She closed her eyes and dreamed of ships emerging from torn reality and a galaxy falling silent with fear. The Cathari Empire had grown tired of patience. For 50 years, they had expanded across the galaxy and conquered anyone who stood in their way. 7 civilizations had fallen under their rule, and their fleet had grown to over 10,000 warships. No one dared to challenge them because no one was strong enough. Human colonies existed at the edge of Cathari space. They had always been ignored because humanity was considered too weak and too poor to bother with. But then Cathari surveyors discovered helium crystals on the human colony of New Montana. These crystals were rare and valuable beyond measure. The Cathari wanted them. Ambassador Daniel Harris stood before the Galactic Assembly with his head slightly bowed. He spoke softly about peace and cooperation. He explained that New Montana was home to 3 million human souls who had built their lives there. He asked if perhaps the Cathari could find helium crystals elsewhere. The Cathari ambassador was a massive reptilian creature named Vexthor. He rose to his full height and made a sound that his species used for laughter. He told the assembly that human colonies existed only because the Cathari allowed them to exist. Humanity would surrender New Montana within 30 rotations, or the Cathari would take it by force. And then they would take everything else. Daniel lowered his head even further and said that humanity would need to consult with their government. Baxter told him to consult quickly because Cathari patience was limited. The assembly watched Daniel leave with pity in their eyes. Everyone knew what would happen. The humans would surrender or they would die. There was no other option for such a weak species. But deep beneath the surface of Earth, in a facility that existed between dimensions, the High Council of the Obsidian Guard was gathering. 12 humans sat around a table that overlooked holographic displays of the entire galaxy. These were the most powerful people in human civilization, and no alien had ever heard their names. Admiral Grace Palmer stood at the head of the table. She had received the news from Daniel an hour ago. The moment they had prepared for across 3 centuries had finally arrived. President Nathan Cole sat at her right hand. The galaxy knew him as the civilian leader of a minor species. They did not know that he controlled the largest military force ever assembled. Grace spoke quietly and said that they had waited 300 years for this moment. The question was simple. Would they continue to hide, or would they show the galaxy what humanity truly was? Admiral Christopher Dunn commanded the Fourth Shadow Fleet. He said that revealing themselves would make humanity a target. Every ambitious race would see them as a threat to be eliminated. General Patricia Webb ran Planetary Defense. She said that humanity was already a target. The Cathari had made that clear. If they did nothing, they would lose New Montana. Then they would lose more. Director Samuel Green led the Intelligence Division. He reported that the Valorian Collective and the Syndicate of Orion were watching closely. If humanity fell to the Cathari, those two powers would divide the remaining human colonies between them. They saw humanity as prey waiting to be consumed. President Cole asked about their options if they chose to reveal themselves. He wanted to know the full strategic picture. Grace activated the holographic display. The galaxy appeared before them with thousands of points of light representing known civilizations. She pointed to the Cathari Empire and said they had 10,000 warships. That was the largest military force in known space. Then she changed the display to show something else. Hidden dimensions unfolded and revealed the true scope of human power. 247,000 warships appeared in formations that stretched across secret space. Weapons platforms the size of small moons orbited in pocket dimensions. Construction yards continued building more ships every day. The Council stared in silence at what their species had created. Grace continued her briefing. She said they also had 18 planet crackers that could shatter worlds into rubble. They had 32-dimensional disruptors that could tear holes in the fabric of space itself. And they had the Omega Array. Nathan Cole repeated those words slowly. The Omega Array had never been tested on a live target. Grace said it had never needed to be tested. The simulations were clear. A single pulse from the array could extinguish every star in a targeted sector. It was not really a weapon. It was an extinction event waiting to happen. General Webb said they had built it as a deterrent. It was something so terrible that no one would ever challenge humanity once they knew it existed. The vote was unanimous. After 300 years of hiding, humanity would finally reveal itself. On New Montana, 3 million colonists looked up at the sky with fear in their hearts. They had been told that Cathari warships were gathering just beyond the edge of their solar system. They had been told to prepare for evacuation. They did not know that help was coming. In the shadow dimensions, the Obsidian Guard began to move. Ships that had waited in silence for centuries powered up their engines. Crews who had trained their entire lives for this moment took their stations. Weapon systems that could reshape reality itself came online. Grace Palmer stood on the bridge of the OSV Judgment and watched her fleet prepare for deployment. This ship was nothing like the primitive wanderer she commanded in public. The Judgment was a kilometer long and carried enough firepower to destroy a small moon. Commander Henry Shaw approached her and said the fleet was ready. All 7,000 ships assigned to the New Montana Defense were prepared to deploy. Grace nodded and gave the order. The dimensional barriers began to open. Reality itself started to tear as humanity prepared to step out of the shadows. She thought about her grandmother, who had spent her life building the foundation for this moment. She thought about her mother who had commanded the first shadow ship. She thought about every human who had kept the secret and played their role for 300 years. The deception was over. The pretending was done. The galaxy was about to learn what humanity had become while no one was watching. Grace looked at the stars through her view screen and whispered that it was time. The ships began to move through the dimensional rifts. The largest military force in galactic history was going to war, but it would not be much of a war. The Cathari had no idea what was coming. No one did. The silence of 300 years was about to be broken. The Cathari fleet arrived at New Montana exactly 30 rotations after their ultimatum. 800 warships dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation. They were the pride of the Empire and had never known defeat. Their weapons could reduce the colony below to molten glass in hours. Fleet Commander Zekthon stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Dominion's Wrath. He watched the blue and green world grow larger on his view screen and felt satisfaction. Human vessels were fleeing toward the edge of the system. Their primitive engines were struggling to carry them to safety. It was pathetic. He ordered his communications officer to signal the fleet. They would begin bombardment in one rotation. Let the humans watch their world burn before the Cathari claimed what was theirs. His sensor officer spoke up with confusion in his voice. He said he was detecting an anomaly. Zekthon demanded an explanation. The officer said there was a spatial distortion forming between their fleet and the planet. He had never seen readings like this before. The instruments were going crazy. Zekthon ordered it on screen. The view screen flickered and then showed something impossible. Space itself was tearing open. It was not the familiar swirl of a hyperspace window. This was something else entirely. A wound in reality was spreading wider and wider until it stretched across thousands of kilometers. And through that wound came ships. They were human ships, but nothing like the primitive vessels the Cathari had observed for centuries. These were massive angular constructs of dark metal. They bristled with weapons that Zekthon could not identify. They emerged in perfect formation one after another, filling the space between his fleet and New Montana. Zekthon demanded a count. His sensor officer's voice was trembling. He said 3,000. Then 4,000. They were still coming. Commander, they were still coming. When the dimensional rift finally closed, 7,000 human warships hung in space. They outnumbered the Cathari fleet nearly 9-1. Each human ship was larger and more heavily armed than anything the Cathari possessed. A communication request appeared on Zekthon's console. He opened it with a claw that felt suddenly unsteady. Admiral Grace Palmer's face appeared on his view screen. She was no longer wearing the humble uniform of a minor species. Her new uniform was black with silver trim. The insignia she wore marked her as something far more powerful than any commander the Cathari had ever faced. She introduced herself as Admiral Grace Palmer of the Obsidian Guard. She said there had been a misunderstanding about New Montana.zex, then demanded to know what was happening. He asked where these ships had come from. This was impossible. Grace said that impossible was a strong word. Then she explained his situation. His fleet was outnumbered and outgunned. The weapons on Cathari ships were approximately 300 years behind current human technology. If he fired a single shot, his entire fleet would be destroyed. Not some of them, all of them. Zex single quotes then accused her of bluffing. Humanity had no military capability. The Cathari had observed them for centuries. Grace smiled, and there was something ancient in that smile. She said yes, they had observed what humanity wanted them to observe. Now she was going to show him something they had kept hidden. The view screen split to show a section of empty space at the edge of the solar system. As Zekthon watched, another dimensional rift opened. Through it came a single object, But this was not a ship. It was the size of a small moon covered in structures that pulsed with barely contained energy. Even across millions of kilometers in Zextiness, instruments screamed warnings about the power readings coming from it. Grace said that was the Omega Array. It was a stellar neutralization weapon. A single pulse could extinguish every star in a sphere roughly 20 light-years in diameter. Humanity had built it in case they ever faced a threat so severe that normal warfare would not work. Zexton felt his heart racing. He said she would destroy herself along with his fleet. Grace said the array operated from dimensional space. It was quite safe for the user. Her expression hardened, and she said she was giving him a choice that he had not given humanity. He could leave this system and return to Kethari space and never threaten a human colony again. Or he could stay and discover exactly how far behind his technology really was. Zexton looked at his tactical display. 7,000 enemy ships surrounded him. A weapon that could kill stars floated nearby. And behind it all was the terrible realization that everything he knew about humanity was a lie. He said his fleet would withdraw. Grace said that was a wise choice. Then she added that she would be watching. Humanity had been pretending to be weak for 300 years. Those days were over. She told him to spread the word. The communication ended. The Kethari fleet turned and fled. 800 warships that had come to conquer retreated in silence. They did not fire a single shot. They did not make a single threat. They simply ran. On New Montana, 3 million colonists watched the sky in disbelief. They had expected death and destruction. Instead, they had witnessed something that would change the galaxy forever. Grace Palmer stood on the bridge of the Judgment and watched the enemy retreat. Commander Henry Shaw stood beside her and said it was over. Grace said no, it was just beginning. The news would spread. Every civilization in the galaxy would hear what happened here. They would learn about the Shadow Fleets and the Omega Array. They would learn that humanity had been lying for 3 centuries, and then they would have to decide what to do about it. She ordered the fleet to hold position until the Kethari were completely gone. Then she sent a message to Earth. The deception was over. Humanity had stepped out of the shadows. The galaxy would never be the same. Within hours, the news reached every corner of known space. The weak little humans with their primitive ships had revealed themselves to be the most powerful civilization anyone had ever seen. They had weapons that could destroy worlds. They had ships that moved through dimensions. They had something that could kill stars. And no one knew what they would do next. The galaxy fell silent. For the first time in recorded history, every species stopped fighting and started watching. They watched humanity and waited to see what the most dangerous civilization in existence would choose to become. The silence stretched across the stars, heavy with fear and wonder. 3 months passed after the confrontation at New Montana, and the galaxy had never been so quiet. Not a single hostile act was committed against any human vessel or colony. Trade negotiations that had been stuck for decades suddenly moved in humanity's favor. Ambassadors who had once ignored human diplomats now begged for meetings. But more telling than the new diplomacy was the fear that hung over everything. Ambassador Daniel Harris sat in his private office on the diplomatic station, orbiting Nexus Prime. He was reading intelligence reports that made him feel proud and uncomfortable at the same time. The galaxy had changed completely, and he was not sure it had changed for the better. The Valorian Collective had withdrawn all their military vessels from within 50 light-years of human space. They wanted nothing to do with a species that could kill stars. The Syndicate of Orion had canceled 3 expansion campaigns because they were worried about accidentally crossing into territory that humanity might care about. Even the Pale Assembly had requested a formal treaty promising that neither side would attack the other. and the Cathari Empire had collapsed entirely. News of their fleet's retreat at New Montana spread quickly across their conquered territories. Worlds that had lived under Cathari rule for generations suddenly saw hope. If the mighty Cathari could be humiliated by the humans, then perhaps they were not so mighty after all. Rebellions erupted everywhere. Within 2 months, the Empire lost control of everything they had conquered. Now, they were fighting for survival in their home systems. Lisa Grant entered the office. She was Daniel's chief aide and had worked with him for 15 years. She asked if something was troubling him because he had been staring at those reports for over an hour. Daniel said it was the silence. He had attended a reception the night before with representatives from 30 different species. Normally, those events were chaos. There was posturing and threats and secret deals being made in every corner. Last night, everyone had just stood around looking nervous. Lisa said they were afraid. Daniel said they were terrified. The Omega Array was all anyone could think about. The whole galaxy knew humanity had a weapon that could extinguish stars. They had gone from being seen as harmless primitives to being the most dangerous civilization in existence. Lisa sat down and asked if that was not what they wanted. They were safe now. No one would ever threaten humanity with invasion again. Daniel set down the report and said he used to think so. But fear was a strange foundation for peace. The Cathari had feared no one, and they became brutal conquerors. What would happen to humanity now that everyone feared them? On Earth, similar questions were being debated at the highest levels. The secret was out, and billions of citizens were demanding answers. President Nathan Cole stood before the General Assembly of the United Nations to address the world. He explained that for 300 years humanity had hidden their true capabilities. They did this not because they wanted to conquer anyone, but because they wanted to survive. They had seen how the galaxy treated the weak. They had seen the endless wars between the strong. They chose a third path. They appeared weak while building the strength to defend themselves against any threat. That threat had finally come. The Cathari tried to take human worlds by force, and they were stopped. Now the galaxy knew what humanity really was. But Nathan said that strength without wisdom was just destruction waiting to happen. Humanity had the power to devastate civilizations and extinguish stars and reshape the entire galaxy through force. They must never use that power except to genuinely defend themselves and those who needed protection. He proposed something called the Palmer Doctrine, named after the admiral who revealed the fleet. It had 3 principles. First, humanity would never use military force for conquest or expansion. Second, humanity would defend any civilization that asked for protection from aggression. Third, the Omega Array would never be used, except against an existential threat to humanity itself. The doctrine passed unanimously. It was broadcast to every corner of the galaxy. Admiral Grace Palmer watched the broadcast from her office on Luna Base. This was the central command center of the Obsidian Guard and the heart of human military power. She had received hundreds of messages from alien governments since New Montana. Most of them said the same thing in different ways. "Please do not hurt us." Commander Henry Shaw brought her evening reports and said she looked troubled. Grace said she had spent her entire career preparing for war. Her grandmother helped build the first shadow ships. Her mother commanded them. Grace trained her whole life to lead humanity's defense against a galaxy that wanted to exploit them. Henry asked what came next. Grace said that now everyone was too afraid to try anything. The Cathari were supposed to be the first of many enemies. Instead, they were the last. She should have been happy. They won without firing a single shot. But she kept wondering what humanity would do with all this power they had accumulated. Henry thought about it and said maybe that was what the next 300 years were for figuring out. Grace looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, civilizations were looking back and waiting to see what humanity would do. They expected conquest because that was what powerful species did. They expected revenge because humanity had been treated badly for centuries. They expected the worst because the worst was all they had ever known. But humanity had not built their strength for conquest. They had built it for survival. Now that survival was guaranteed, they needed a new purpose. The silence of the galaxy pressed in around her. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the silence of creatures holding their breath and waiting for the predator to move. Grace did not want to be a predator. She did not want humanity to become what they had hidden from for so long. But she also knew that power changed things. It changed people and it changed civilizations. The humans of today were not the same as the humans who signed the Antarctic Accord 3 centuries ago. She wondered what her grandmother would think of all this. The old woman had dedicated her life to building weapons in secret. She believed humanity would have to fight for every inch of space they claimed. She never imagined they might find another way. But maybe there was another way. Maybe strength could be used for something besides destruction. Maybe the silence could become something other than fear. Grace made a decision. She would not let humanity become another empire. She would not let 300 years of preparation lead to 300 years of tyranny. There had to be something better. She just had to figure out what it was. 5 years had passed since humanity revealed its true power, and something strange had happened. The most powerful civilization in the galaxy refused to act like it. The Palmer Doctrine had been tested 3 times. Each time, an aggressive species threatened a weaker neighbor human. Warships appeared from dimensional space and stood between them. No shots were fired. None needed to be. The mere presence of the Obsidian Guard was enough to end conflicts before they began. Ambassador Daniel Harris had become the most important diplomat in galactic history. Everyone wanted to talk to him. Everyone wanted to understand what humanity was planning. He walked through the corridors of the new Galactic Forum, feeling the weight of 1,000 eyes upon him. The Forum was built in neutral space to replace the old assembly that had failed to prevent wars. It was humanity's idea and humanity's gift to the galaxy. A place where every species could meet as equals. Walking beside Daniel was someone he never expected to call a friend. Vexther had been the Kethari ambassador who threatened to destroy New Montana 5 years ago. His empire had collapsed, but his people had survived. Now they were building something new under the protection of the very species they once tried to conquer. Vexther said that humanity could have destroyed them. When the empire fell, the Kethari were defenseless. Many species expected humanity to take revenge for the threats and insults of the past. Daniel said that vengeance was never the point. Humanity did not hide for 3 centuries because they wanted to punish anyone. They hid because they wanted to survive. Now they were trying to figure out what came after survival. Vex. Tar asked what did come after. Daniel smiled and said, that was what they were all here to decide. The Forum chamber was filled with representatives from over 200 civilizations. Every spacefaring species had sent delegates. They came because humanity invited them. They came because despite their fear, they recognized something unusual about these strange beings from a small blue world. Humanity had power beyond imagination and chose not to use it. That simple fact changed everything. Grace Palmer stood at the podium looking out at the assembled delegates. She had retired from active command the year before and passed leadership of the Obsidian Guard to a new generation. Now she served as humanity's voice in galactic affairs. She began by talking about the past. 300 years ago, humanity discovered they were not alone in the universe. They learned that space was filled with civilizations that had been fighting each other for millions of years. They saw empires rise and fall. They saw species exterminated and worlds destroyed. They decided they did not want to be part of that cycle. So they hid. They pretended to be weak while building strength to protect themselves. Some might call that deception. Perhaps it was. But it came from fear, not malice. They were afraid of what the galaxy might do to them. 5 years ago, they stopped hiding. They showed everyone their ships and weapons and true capabilities. Many expected humanity to become conquerors, to use power the way others have used it throughout history. They chose differently. And Grace wanted to explain why. She said humanity learned something in their long history on Earth. They learned that power without purpose was empty. They learned that fear created resentment, and resentment created conflict. They learned that the strongest nations were not always the best ones, and the richest were not always the happiest. Humanity did not want to rule the galaxy. They did not want to be feared. What they wanted was what they had always wanted: to survive and grow and explore and create. And they understood they could not do any of those things alone. The Galactic Forum was their proposal for a new era. Not an empire. Not a hierarchy. A partnership. Every civilization had knowledge that others lacked. Every species had perspectives that could benefit everyone. For too long, the galaxy had been divided by fear and competition. It could be united by cooperation instead. Humanity spent 300 years preparing for war. Now, they wanted to spend the next 300 years preparing for peace. They invited everyone to join them. The silence that followed was different from the silence of fear. It was the silence of beings considering something they had never imagined possible. Then slowly one delegate rose to their feet. Then another. And another. By the time Grace finished speaking, every representative in the forum was standing. Later that evening, Daniel found Grace on the observation deck watching the stars. He said it was quite a speech. Grace said she meant every word. Then she asked if he thought they believed her. Daniel said he thought they wanted to believe her. That was a start. Grace said her grandmother would have been amazed by today. The old woman spent her life building weapons in secret. She was convinced humanity would have to fight for every inch of space they claimed. She never imagined there might be another way. Daniel asked if Grace had imagined it. Grace thought about the question carefully. She said she hoped. In the quiet moments when she was not running simulations or planning strategies, she hoped that all their preparations would lead to something better than just another war. Daniel asked if it had. She looked out at the stars. Ships from 100 civilizations were docked peacefully around the forum station. Lights from distant worlds blinked in the darkness. Species that had been enemies for millennia were talking to each other for the first time. Grace said to ask her again in 300 years. They were just getting started. The galaxy had fallen silent when humanity revealed its power. That silence had been born of fear and uncertainty. No one knew what the humans would do with their terrible weapons and endless fleets. 5 years later, the silence was beginning to change. It was becoming something else. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of listening. Civilizations that had shouted at each other for eons were finally quiet enough to hear. And in that new silence, something was growing. Trust, perhaps. Or hope. Or simply the understanding that things could be different if enough people chose to make them different. Humanity had hidden for 300 years and built weapons that could end worlds. Now they were stepping into the light and trying to build something else. Something that had never existed before. A galaxy at peace. It would take time. It would take patience. There would be setbacks and failures and moments when the old ways seemed easier. But for the first time in recorded history, every species was willing to try. Grace Palmer watched the stars and thought about her grandmother and her mother and everyone who came before. They built the tools of war so their children could choose peace. She intended to honor that sacrifice. The new era had begun.